Hi, everybody. We still have a few people coming in, so we're going to give it just another minute, but I'm looking forward to talking to you tonight about the history of conservation in Hanover, or how to string a green necklace bead by bead. This is our Earth Day presentation for the Hanover Conservancy. All right, why don't we get going? Wanted to welcome you tonight, and I have a co-welcomer. Cindy Bittinger is with us tonight for the Hanover Historical Society, and we are delighted to be partnering with the Historical Society in this presentation. There's something about Hanover's natural history and its cultural history that really are closely intertwined, and we want to be partners all through this. So I'm going to invite Cindy to say a couple of words before we launch our program.
Hi there. I mainly want to thank Adair for coming up with this idea. We love to hear the history of how the green spaces in Hanover have been developed. And the more we learn this history, the more it will matter to our children, our grandchildren, and subsequent generations. I feel that when you hear about history, you start to value your environment much more. So we look forward to this talk. Adair has planned it for quite a while, and we just feel that it's great that she's willing to do this. So thank you, Adair.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. All right. We also need to thank the New Hampshire Humanities Council tonight, provided a small grant to help us move ahead with this. And this is a great organization. If you haven't clued into their wide variety of programs around the state on many, many topics of interest, you should look it up. It's a wonderful amenity to have in our state. So I'm, of course, going to give you just a quickie shot about the Hanover Conservancy, just so that you know who's talking to you tonight. We are the oldest local land trust in the state of New Hampshire, and this is our 60th anniversary. You'll hear more about that in a minute. We're a nonprofit membership organization, independent of the town of Hanover. No, we don't have a line item in the town budget. So we're funded largely by private donations. And I know a number of you on the call tonight are Hanover Conservancy members, and I thank you very much for that confidence and that support. Our mission is simple: protect the land and waters in our community. And we do it through land conservation, stewardship, education, and advocacy for conservation-oriented public policy. This is a way of sharing the story of our community's natural heritage. We're very proud that nearly a quarter of Hanover households are members of the Hanover Conservancy, but not just here in Hanover. 12 states, a province, 40 towns. We're very small but spunky, 2 full-time staff, 13 hardworking board members, 80 or so volunteers, and a very modest annual budget. And here's our home. We are on Route 10 North, just before you get to Kendall, and we saved you a parking spot there. If you care to come and hop on the trails behind our office, you can get from our office on Route 10 all the way to the peak of Moose Mountain with barely hitting a road at all. So we need to talk about how conservation began in Hanover, and it began literally thousands and thousands of years ago as the Abenaki came into the area following the retreat of the glacier, and they have been with us now and ever since, sharing their conservation-minded thinking with us, urging us to manage our lands in responsible ways. And we are listening, and we are grateful for the advice and support that we've had. But we also know we have this very long tradition of conservation belief with the people of the Dawn who have lived here forever. Now, this is what Hanover looked like after European Americans had their crack at the landscape for quite some time. This is an 1865 view from about the Lebanon-Hanover town line, looking north towards downtown over Mink Brook. The first conservation of our modern era that happened in Hanover was the protection of Pine Park. It occurred in 1900. 5 years later, the Pine Park Association was formed to preserve 93 acres there. And if you can believe it, those beautiful trees were being eyed by the Diamond Match Company to make those beautiful trees into matches. No, thank goodness it didn't happen. And it set an example for the history of our town moving forward. We're going to focus quite a bit on Mink Brook tonight because there's such a long conservation story associated with it. This is the Charles Stone Farm at Mink Brook, a view above in 1948, kind of looking toward the northwest. And it wasn't long after this that residential development began there. The lower shot is pretty much the same piece of land in 1957. Now, let's think about what was going on in Hanover and in the Upper Valley at that time. Water pollution was pervasive. The Connecticut River had long been known as New England's best landscape sewer, and they were not fooling around when they talked like this. You know, what goes in a cow comes out a cow. This is the Fairleigh Town dump. This is, until the late 1940s, what was sitting in Wilder, Vermont, on the site of today's Kilowatt Park, the International Paper Mill, which contributed at least 124 different contaminants to the sediment that can be found there today. But a 1952 government report of our area found that of the Connecticut River's 269 miles in New Hampshire and Vermont, 219 they classified as damaged, unsafe for swimming and fishing, unsuitable even for some industry, unsafe for watering crops that you weren't going to cook, and sometimes the water ran different colors depending on what the mills were using for dyes that day. Mink Brook was no different. When these little boys went out in their boat on Mink Brook, their mother said, "Don't fall in." This is before the Clean Water Act. This is also the time that, you know, some of us might remember the news, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire in 1969. And this is the era of pesticides like DDT that were being used on the golf course or neighboring areas. Derivatives of those pesticides are still lingering in the river sediments off that area today. They were discovered by EPA in the year 2000. But this is also the time of the Back to the Land movement, people leaving the cities, wanting to come live a clean life in a clean environment. Maybe some of you recognize this particular fellow. He was among the people who left New York City and made himself a little home in an abandoned sugar shack and bought some land. And if you don't recognize him, maybe you recognize him now. That's Bernie, and that's part of his history. So in 1961, Hanover had no townwide zoning. There was zoning around the precinct area downtown. President Kennedy was beginning the first year of his administration, and our beloved co-op food store was on Main Street. And in March of that year at town meeting, when town meeting was held on the second Tuesday in March, a consultant had prepared a study for the town of Hanover to make recommendations about what should be part of their very first townwide zoning ordinance. And included in that recommendation was to protect a green necklace around downtown. Well, that natural preserve zone, as it was going to be called, was proposed, and it was the only part that was not adopted. So while townwide zoning had gone into effect, this part, which these five friends felt was critical, was not incorporated in that. So they got together that very afternoon and they got to work. The very next day, 100 people in town who were similarly concerned signed a petition to protect the river shoreline. A couple of years later, in 1963, this is a scene on Balch Hill with the paper bag club that loved to take their paper bags out and have picnic lunches in beautiful spots around town. Got together and they had been thinking for a while with among them these 5 friends, what was going to happen, what difference could they make. One of our founders is the woman with the sunglasses on the left-hand side. That's Carolyn Tenney, our very first president. And she, among others, Bob Norman, Gene Hennessy, George Wrightson, and Ted Hunter were among the 5 who got together to form the Hanover Conservation Council. Now, Bob told me that they didn't want to have a name right away because they thought, well, it might sound like there was something controversial to talk about. So they went nameless for a couple of years until they decided, yep, it's time to incorporate. And their very first order of business really was to urge the creation of a town conservation commission after enabling legislation had been passed by the state legislature. And then the year after that, they said, you know what, we're going to have to buy some land. We need some money. And they started a land acquisition account with $1,000. That organization, which is now the Hanover Conservancy, was all volunteer for the first 40 years, if you can imagine. Bob Norman's on the far left here, Ann Crow in the pink jacket in the back, and Steve Fowler taking notes at a place that we'll visit again in a minute. We've had some wonderful presidents over the years. Carolyn Tenney, our first, Bob, as I mentioned, and a number of others, including Joyce Knoll, who I know is on the call. And Joyce, I do not have a good picture of you, and I apologize. Jim Hornig, who started the Environmental Studies Department at Dartmouth, was a later president. David Peart, also in the Biological Sciences at Dartmouth. Betsy McGeehan, who works for the Trust for Public Land. Nancy Collier, a former chair of the Conservation Commission and later the Planning Board in Hanover. Christine McDevitt, an attorney with Twin Pines Housing Trust. And our current president, Heidi Tremarco, who is an attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation. We're very proud of our people. The conservation footprint, and I'm talking right now about the Hanover Conservancy. I will expand it as well as I can to all the conservation activity that's happened in town. I should have said from the get-go, if you've ever seen Bill Bryson's book, The History of the World, in 450 pages, well, you know he left a few things out. That's going to happen here, not intentionally, but I hope you'll hang with me on that. But the Hanover Conservation Council, now the Conservancy owns 453 acres ourselves outright, easements on another 566. And then here's the really important part, helping others conserve land in town. So it's really a group story. So in 1967, Pine Park, as you see on the left, had already been protected. The first real project that the Conservation Council worked on was the Angelo Tanzi natural area here on the southwest corner of town. Perfectly beautiful spot. 15.8 acres here were protected. The Conservation Council provided half of the purchase price to the town, and so the town now owns it. I'm going to show you some very strange looking maps through this presentation, and you'll have to pardon the color scheme. They're not my choice, but and I will go into that in a second, but I want to point out, if you can see my cursor, the piece of land we're talking about is right here. And the colors here indicate habitat quality as determined by the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. The violent pinky purple color indicates tier 1 or highest quality habitat in the state. And here is that unfortunately colored map. It does get its point across, however. You see Hanover here. There are maps like this made for every town in the state. This issue was done in 2015. I hope a new series is coming out soon, but essentially the pinky stuff is very high quality habitat. The green is highest ranked habitat in the biological region. And then what is shown in mustard is really also very important landscape to support that high quality habitat. So every time we visit a piece of land, we're going to check in on how does it score on this map. Now, next project, 1970, the Balch Hill Natural Areas Summit. This was a spot that had been loved for years. As you can see, the Paper Bag Club, they were not the first to enjoy its beautiful views. In 1970, the Conservation Council purchased the summit, 10.3 acres around the summit, for $18,000 from the Garapay family who had been farming it. And it was the very first piece of land that we owned ourselves. We had done conservation work previously in Lyme, in Plainfield, and even over in Grafton, New Hampshire. But today we're going to be focusing on Hanover. So there it is. Now the next one on the far, far, far southwest corner of town is the South Esker. This is an extraordinary place. It's outlined in yellow on this map, along with the trails that you can see on the Connecticut River near its confluence with Mink Brook. Just a wonderful spot for swimming. Never mind the rope swings. In 1971, 14 acres were purchased from a nearby landowner for $10,000, and $10,000 was raised by the Hanover Conservation Council to give to the town to help them purchase the land. I should say that in this time, the Land and Water Conservation Fund began to prove its incredible worth here in Hanover. Congress had established this fund in 1964 using offshore oil and gas leases, not taxpayer money, to provide to states and communities to purchase and to do great conservation work, and sometimes really just things revolving around recreation. It was permanently reauthorized in 2019, finally, after years of doubt about what was going to happen to it. And this is a map of how that money has been spent in our town of Hanover. The purple dots, as you can well imagine, follow the Appalachian Trail as it goes through our town. And over the years, over $196 million has come from the Land and Water Conservation Fund for Appalachian Trail related land protection. And that's all over from Maine to Georgia. But here in our town, the blue spots indicate places where a total of $422,000 has been spent in Hanover. And this is everything from, the ballpark at Tenny Fields or the playground at Tenny Fields to some money spent at Fullington Fields, the Wilson's Landing, also Kendall Riverfront Park, but also at the South Esker, as you can see on the far left-hand side right over here. This was part of what went to purchase that land. And it's got a fabulous geological history. One of our former board members, Carl Renshaw, on the right in the black shirt, is giving a geology tour for some of our people a couple of years ago. And if we look at that Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game map, we can see in the deep purple, this is the area that is considered such high value habitat. So even though this map had not been published at this time, Conservation Council members and community members who were volunteering with them understood and had a good eye for good habitat. It's a perfectly beautiful place, no matter what the season. And right across Mink Brook from it, outlined here in green, is the town's Mink Brook Natural Area. In 1973, just 2 years after the South Esker, the Conservation Council helped the town purchase 15 plus acres there with the trails that I know you all are aware of and enjoy, the brook and the river shore. And here again, Land and Water Conservation Fund monies came into play. And you can see this area and how it is ecologically interesting on this aerial photograph from 1936. So let's go north on the Connecticut River over here to the Rinker Tract. This is Rinker Pond, which is just below Storrs Pond. It's the outlet of Storrs Pond between that and the Connecticut River. And again, here look on this map, it's this piece of land right here with supporting landscape in yellow, and then this high quality habitat in this pink color. In 1973, the Conservation Council purchased 17.5 acres from Jack Rinker and his wife, and gave them to the town along with the trails and Rinker Pond there. Trails are challenging, but not too much for that very old dog of mine. In that same year, the New Hampshire Current Use Program came into effect after the legislature did some work following the passage of Proposition 7 in 1968, where New Hampshire voters voted overwhelmingly to allow land to be taxed based on its current use value, meaning its income producing value was farm or woodlot and not its developable value. So the Constitution required that then this change was made, and it provided for a lot of a pause in the development and more close thinking and careful planning about how development was going to occur. It also provided for a land use change tax. When land was taken out of the current use program, the town then got compensation for what had been held off the tax rolls, partially off the tax rolls, and was then able to use some of that funding to purchase other conservation land. Some of it goes to the general fund, but some of it goes to the Conservation Commission to spend on protecting land elsewhere in town. This was a really great boost because then there was another pocketbook to draw on, not just private pockets. And meanwhile, back at Balch Hill, 126 condos were proposed for land on the hill, and then that got cut down to 49 houses. This whole thing ended up in the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And it was partly because this was kind of the image for what might have happened at Balch Hill. The Levitt brothers, who had developed Levittown on Long Island, had their eye on Balch Hill and were eager to develop it. The planning board held firm and they won in the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And in 1978, the Conservation Council helped the town purchase 25 acres, going to 250 donors, and also again relying on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So now Balch Hill was comprised of 35 acres. Now we're going to go to the eastern side of town, far eastern corner, to the Marshall Brook Wetlands natural area. And again, a spot of very high value habitat here. Some glorious wetlands that you can walk on, thank goodness, in the wintertime. We're on a tour out here with Alcott Smith, who always has a trick up his sleeve, or we found out that day, a bag of bear dung in his jacket to show us all. We got a chance to visit a beaver lodge in the wintertime. In 1977, the Conservation Council purchased 96 acres here and resold them to the town, with the cost ending up that we paid for a quarter of it, the town paid for a quarter, and the rest of the funding for it came from the Federal Bureau of Outdoor Recreation. And then in 1985, thank goodness, the Upper Valley Land Trust was formed. For many years, 24 years, almost a quarter century, the Hanover Conservation Council had been working hard as all volunteers in the Upper Valley, but mostly concentrating on Hanover. And it was many, many voices were saying from surrounding towns, you know, we want a land trust like that for our community. And so some of our board members got together with Dana Meadows and some other interested people and clever, far-sighted people, and formed the Upper Valley Land Trust in that year. And we're so grateful that they did. We've got a wonderful partner. They joined the Forest Society that had already been working in our area. So we're fortunate that we have such expertise active and available in our region. Of course, this was about the time when the Appalachian Trail was being rerouted by the federal government onto protected land. Benton MacKay's vision for the Appalachian Trail as a through hikers mission of finding peace on the trail had really taken hold. And I'm sure the Dartmouth Outing Club had a lot to do with that in our area. In the 1980s, it was realized that much of this was traveling over unconserved private land, and in some cases was a real burden on the landowners. So with possibly a heavy footprint in some cases, the federal government came in and said, all right, we're going to find, so we're going to reroute it in some places, and they did quite a bit of land protection. You can see now the path of the AT as it goes through our town, and you can see the green ribbon that accompanies it, the corridor. Some places it's pretty darn narrow, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. So we're going to go back to the far eastern part of town, and this is the beautiful McKinley Tract. For a period of 6-7 years, the Conservation Council worked to protect 125 acres here. A 12-lot subdivision had been proposed. Finally, we were able to purchase it and convey it to the town. The Conservancy still holds a conservation easement on it. I should stop for a moment and say, you've been hearing a lot about the Conservation Council did this and then turned it over to the town. Well, in many cases, where we were talking about a piece of land that the town was already very interested in acquiring, had already done the research, had helped drum up interest in the community for protection, but cannot act to acquire a piece of land until town meeting. And so, especially in the case of where a developer or a landowner was really anxious to sell and liquidate their property, we were able to step in, purchase the property, and then when town meeting could deliver an affirmative vote, then turn it over to the town. So this was an important service and something that we were always happy to provide. Here we are out monitoring the property with Vicki Smith, the town's senior planner in the center, and who has quite a conservation background of her own to be very proud of. Gail McPeak on the left, former board member who's still very active with us and does a lot of stewardship work with us, and our former president, Nancy Collier. We were out checking boundaries that day. But you can also see here in this map on the left-hand side, we've got tier 2 habitat, tier 3 habitat, and then along the brook here, it's very high quality habitat as well. Okay, it's like whiplash, back to the riverfront now on the western side of town. Fullington Fields. What a gorgeous spot. We all enjoy that view every day when we drive down Route 10. In 1991, the Conservation Council led an effort to protect 26 acres here for the river views, trail access, and providing for agricultural use. This was when the state's first conservation program, the land LCIP, Land Conservation Investment Program, was in full swing, and this is part of the funding that was used to purchase this easement. To the center north of town, I think many of you might know Huntington Hill. It's a 500-acre piece of absolutely wonderful land, forest land, wetlands, some beautiful open fields that were protected by Dr. Sam Doyle in 1991 with the easement held by the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. The current landowner is Steve Lebrano, who and his wife Allegra. I'm delighted that Steve is a brand new member of our board of directors. The Conservation Council had no role in all of this, but it was wonderful, wonderful to see it happen. Back over to the eastern side of town, and we're going to look at that little speck there. That is the Tunis Brook Mill Lot, and what a fabulous place this is if you haven't been. In 1994, we were given a gift to buy just 1.5 acres of land here that had gotten lost on the tax rolls. Nobody knew who it belonged to, and the town was rather anxious to just figure out a future for this piece of land. So because it was located between the McKinley Tract and the town forest, that seemed like a strategic place to have some land, but also very, very high quality habitat. Again, as you can see, the yellow arrow is pointing to that spot on the map it left. What's really fascinating about this place is not only is the habitat high quality, but it is the site of a former up and down sawmill that we think lasted only about 11 years until a freshet, serious heavy rainstorm, washed out the mill, and it was never rebuilt. And one of the wonderful things about visiting this place is just on the other side of the property line on land that is privately owned for conservation purposes is this wonderful glacial erratic. And I have to tell you, I have a soft spot in my heart for glacial erratics. I like to collect them. They don't fit in your pocket too easily, but it's lots of fun to visit them. All right, back to the center of town and to the upper Slade Brook area. In 1997, we worked with New Hampshire Fish and Game and protected an additional 42 acres adjacent to Huntington Hill. We hold a secondary easement here. This is land that until recently was owned by Jim Kennedy, whom you see on the left, who managed it for spectacular woodcock habitat. And he was very generous in offering trips out there to let people see what the habitat conditions were, and then as dusk approached, to witness the courtship dance of the woodcock. Again, really high quality habitat, as you see right here. Back to the southern border of the town, and this is the Mink Brook Nature Preserve. In 1999, 112 acres here, so close to downtown, were slated for a 32-lot subdivision. At this time, our organization was still all volunteer, and we knew this was going to be a very heavy lift because the price tag on this was $1.2 million. So we fortunately had the help and interest and expertise of the Upper Valley Land Trust to work on this with us. We were able to find 500 donors, but 499 of those 500 were able to help us come up with $400,000. And there we sat, wondering what was going to happen next, until a call came in from Dartmouth College saying, would a check for $800,000 help? Well, indeed it did. This is the Mink Brook Nature Preserve today. Here above, you see the Tanzi tract we talked about earlier. Here's Route 120. Here's Buck Road. Here's UVLT's office, and they were able to acquire some land around their space. And also, this is the Hanover land that we talked about earlier, the 1970s. So this is what it is. It's this part that goes down to the Lebanon line here, over onto this hilltop surrounding Mink Brook. I'm sure many of you have been there. It's a spot that's easy access for strollers and walkers and wheelchairs. Look at the quality of the habitat here. This map still hadn't been published, but people in our group had quite an instinct for high quality habitat. A simply lovely place. And we do need to thank Dartmouth for this, of course. Interestingly, this property has a very special place in Dartmouth's history. This land and the land around it, and Mink Brook in particular, are the reason that Dartmouth College is here in Hanover. When the colonial governor, John Wentworth, was helping Eleazar Wheelock find a place for his college, he hadn't settled on where he was going to plop his college. He brought him here, and he had control over 1,000 acres of land that his uncle Benning Wentworth, the previous colonial governor, had set aside for himself. Of course, all of this appropriated from the Abenaki, who were the original owners. And Governor Wentworth essentially said, along with the proprietors of Hanover and Lebanon, who threw in another 500 acres each, so offered Dr. Wheelock 2,000 acres surrounding Mink Brook if he would put his college in Hanover. And what sealed the deal here was this little falls on Mink Brook, where he could build a sawmill and have a mill privilege. And here's the remains of part of that. So Dartmouth is here in Hanover because of Mink Brook. We should also remind ourselves that this is a deeply, deeply special place, to not only to the Euro-American settlers who came here and their successors and us today, but also to the people of the Don who regard this with a special reverence. And it is a place that holds a special spot in their hearts and will for many, many years in the future. It's a great place to go, no matter your age, no matter your ability. And it's also a great place for wild brook trout. In 2012, we did a study of we assisted with a study that was led by New Hampshire Fish and Game. You see their cold water species biologist here, Diane Timmons, and the Trout Unlimited's wild brook trout joint venture. And they studied wild brook trout habitat and censused the trout populations throughout the watershed of Mink Brook. But when they got down here to the Mink Brook Nature Preserve, and we're talking 500 yards from downtown Hanover, she looked at the habitat in Trout Brook, which is a small tributary that comes in from the south, looked at me and said, this is as good wild brook trout habitat as any I have seen anywhere in the state of New Hampshire. And her home territory is up in the North Country, and I know what she's talking about in terms of beautiful brook trout habitat. We were very flattered. So there's been a lot of work henceforward to care for this land. It was abandoned agricultural land, which means that it was covered with invasive species. Glossy buckthorn, Japanese knotweed, honeysuckle. A lot of replanting happened, a lot of assistance from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We've made a good dent in it and we are replanting. We hear more about that in a minute. But there was also a nice old farm dump that got uncovered by Tropical Storm Irene. And thank goodness we had our crew from Hypertherm. That's the stuff they hauled out of it in one day. Quite something. This is also a spot where we have recently dedicated an overlook seating area to our founder, Bob Norman, who was president of our organization at the time that we acquired this property. It's got great wood turtle habitat. I'm not going to tell you exactly where, but here are some students from the environmental studies program at Hanover High School, along with our program coordinator, Courtney Dragiff, who you see in the center of the screen in her waders, looking for wood turtles. And the students were back last Friday. The Hanover High School Environmental Club worked with us to plant 200 native red oak and silver maple here down at the Mink Brook Nature Preserve in honor of Earth Day. We had great plans for doing this last year to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And I think we all know what happened to that. So what's left over from that experience is the masks that everybody wore, and the event was redesigned so that they were done in small groups, but it was a great day. And if you come in the Brook Road Gate, you'll be able to see some of their plantings just off to the right. So back at Balch Hill again, in 2000 now, 30 years had gone by since we had acquired the summit, but then the Hunter family gave us another 10 acres on the west side, on the Hemlock Road side. You can see it over here on the left. And this really kind of brought the whole parcel together into one unit. The other piece of it, sort of here, see if you follow my cursor here, here's the summit parcel that we acquired in 1970. Here's the parcel we acquired in 2000. Here's the 25-acre parcel that came to the town of Hanover. And then Dartmouth owns 18 acres on the east side of it, along Grass Road. And the college is very generous in letting us have the trails there, the new Chapman Trail, some view clearing. Been very generous also in allowing us to reroute the Maple Trail on part of their property over here. The land is not permanently protected, that part of it. The rest of it is, of course. But we also know that it's at least at this point designated in the nature preserve zone that is in our zoning. Everybody has fun up there in the springtime with Kite Day. We thought maybe one more year would have to go by without our annual Kite Day celebration. So we're doing something different with red kite candy this year, and you'll find that on our website. There's lots of work to do for caring at Balch Hill too. Here's another hypertherm crew that built a wetland crossing for us. High school kids made trails, volunteers prune our apple trees. Here's the Upper Valley Trails Alliance high school youth crew rerouting the Grass Road Trail. We are constantly battling invasives there. We manage a deer hunting program. We're clearing for views, but it's quite a spot. And we are very fortunate to have a wonderful committee of volunteers there, the Balch Hill Stewardship Committee. They keep a really close eye on this place, and they devote a lot of time and effort and love to it. Now, right about this time, conservation planning got a big boost when geographic information systems, fondly known as GIS, became much more available to planners like conservation planners like us. This actually was a technology that had its origins in the 1840s in Britain, when they were trying to figure out why certain neighborhoods people were coming down with cholera. And that the notion that was behind that ended up with this kind of technology, and it allows us to set use remote mapping to map our conservation priorities and help us in our planning. So for example, in the remote part of Hanover, east of 3 Mile Road, we have a certain set of conservation priorities, and they include things like beefing up our resilience to climate change, providing refuge in the cooler temperatures, higher elevations for wildlife, assembling large blocks of unfragmented forest, providing some flood security for headwater streams so that we can mitigate flooding that might happen downstream, say as Mink Brook flows right through Edna Village, and of course trail connections, because Hanover people are trail people. But this is how we used GIS, and this is a very simplified version, just to give you the idea. We'd start with a map like this, and we'd put a couple of layers on. The colors of green indicate elevation. Everything above 1,500 feet is the darker green. It's above 1,000 feet if it's the pale green. The red lines indicate trails. Put that together with the state's habitat map, which you saw earlier. I couldn't help myself. I had to change the colors. I couldn't stand the colors. So we went to those instead. And then you add what lands are already protected. So if you want to build on them to get to decrease the chance of fragmenting the forest there, you put it all together and you come up with something like this that can give you sort of a color-coded idea of where you really might want to look closely for conservation potential. And I should mention right away that our organization, as do anybody other than the federal government, really works only with willing landowners. We might knock on a door and say, would you like to talk about conservation? We'll get to one of those soon. But if someone is not ready or not interested, then that's something for another day. So how do we apply GIS to Hanover? We have an entire series of strategic conservation priorities. You can see them kind of illustrated here. And imagine this like a club sandwich. If you were to slice through all these layers, imagine one layer is the tomato, another layer is the ham, another layer is the mustard, another, the bread, the whatever. The more stuff you encounter as you slice through that sandwich, then you can begin to get a sense of where's the concentration of priority lands. And this is a conglomerate map of our strategic conservation priorities, specifically aimed at confronting climate change. Because we are a one-town land trust, we can be much more fine-grained in our approach to this kind of thing than if we were dealing with 75, 100 towns or the whole state. We have different priorities and different weighting for these values depending on where you are in town. So this map is one that we squashed all together. I don't want to give you the impression that we don't care about anything in downtown Hanover. We very much do, but it just shows up differently on our separate map. So let's return to some more conservation work here. We've got over on this part of town is the Fuller lot on Moose Mountain. In 2002, we partnered with the town's Conservation Commission to purchase 34 acres for the town. And that is now in town ownership. We had no other role. And to my knowledge, there's not a conservation restriction on it, but we know that the town plans to manage it for conservation. And it's the northernmost of these two. This is the Fuller lot. The town also then later acquired this lot just farther south. Also, a very generous landowner in Hanover, Jim Baum, and his wife Carol owned 238 acres on the eastern side of Moose Mountain. And in 2005, they protected this with the town. And there are some wonderful trails out there. It's a great place to explore. And I do encourage you to look it up. We had no role in this, but it's another one where we're just delighted that it happened. So opposite end of town, the northwest corner is the Jim and Evalyn Hornig natural area at Lower Slade Brook. I'm sure most of you have been here. Lovely, lovely waterfalls, especially at this time of year. In 2005, a developer had acquired a gravel pit near here and this particular land, and he was prepared to spread homes all over this area. But we worked with the developer to cluster the homes in the area that had been the gravel pit and then protect this land around it so that those homes could, the residents there could enjoy this, and the whole general public could as well. So it ended up being nearly 40 acres along Slade Brook and the Connecticut River. The Upper Valley Land Trust holds a conservation easement because at the time we were really just getting going with a half-time executive director. But we also hold a conservation easement ourselves on the back lots over here of the homes that front Slade Brook. Again, very, very high quality habitat here. And what a great place to explore with your family. Great place for Louisiana water thrush on the left. And for a little fellow who just wanted to find out what was in the bottom of that stream. So let's go not too far from downtown off Greensboro Road. This is the Greensboro Ridge Natural Area. And in 2008, similar story. We worked with the developer and the town to cluster homes closer to Greensboro Road. The plan originally had been for this 113 acres plus the developed part to spread high-end homes all up the hillside. And the thought again was, well, why don't we cluster those down below, save the developer money on the infrastructure they were going to have to building the roads, building the utilities, running all of that power and water and sewer and everything to those homes. If they only had to run it up a certain point, it would save the developer money. And the condition for the protection of this was that the developer would then transfer this 113 acres of backland that abutted the Appalachian Trail corridor to the Hanover Conservation Council at the time, and the Conservation Commission of Hanover would hold a conservation easement on it. This is just a great place, just a great place. And all of those little dots there that you see are vernal pools scattered throughout the property. The green on the upper part of the map here, this is federal land owned by the National Park Service for the Appalachian Trail corridor. And you see here, the AT actually dips onto our property very briefly before heading north. This is the Velvet Rocks development, and over south of this is the Silent Brook development, and there are trails here that connect the two of them. A really gorgeous spot. Again, look at the habitat quality here. Let's go back to the river area, and the Rinker-Steele natural area was finally assembled in 2010 when we worked with the town to purchase the Steele Tract and conserve it along with the Rinker Tract that we had purchased back in the 70s. And I want to point out a wonderful former board member of ours here in the red. This is Dick Burney from the Earth Sciences Department at Dartmouth, who was a member of our board at the time and was just an incredible wealth of knowledge and helped us get our GIS mapping up and running. Very grateful to him and miss him a lot. Here are the trails around there, just to orient you a little bit. Kendall is right over here. That beautiful Ferguson Field is open here, and here's Stores Pond. And all the Stores Pond trails connect with the trails on the Rinker-Steele natural area. There's also a new trail that runs pretty much in this direction here. Well, 2011 came along, and we realized that the Hanover Conservation Council was being regularly confused with the Conservation Commission, and even, if you can imagine it, the Hanover Country Club, HCC. So we decided it would be easier on everybody if we found a new name, and so we did. We decided to become the Hanover Conservancy. Bob Norman did admit to me once that they'd chosen the name Hanover Conservation Council because he said, you know, it sounded kind of official, like we had some kind of authority, which of course we didn't, but it might help people think we were a real thing. So anyway, we're now the Hanover Conservancy, not affiliated with the Nature Conservancy, which is a global organization, but we like the name too. Okay. Now we're back on Moose Mountain and the Mare Niles Forest. In 2013, we received the very generous gift of 92 acres abutting the Appalachian Trail corridor on the mountain. And we're talking here about this area. This is the AT land. And then this green area here is what we're talking about. Here up above, we've draped a projection onto a Google Earth scene so that you can really get an idea of how far up the mountainside this goes. And aren't we glad that we don't have a whole lot of glittering lights at night shining at us from Moose Mountain up there. Lily and Michael Mayer and John Niles gave us the property. This is our former president, Nancy Collier, on the left. And it really does complement the Appalachian Trail corridor, which is the land up above it here. A really neat spot. There are some fascinating white ledges up there. The land had been owned by International Paper at one time, and so their tote road, which went directly down the mountainside, is still in our trail system because there's not a whole lot of way around it, but we have added a few more trails just south of that. And I have to say, it's very high quality bear habitat, as you see on the lower left. I think it's time for me to replace my hiking boots. So looking a little shabby. Then back to the north center of town. This is the Moisture Meadow, owned by Korg Moisture, who gave us a conservation easement on 21 acres of this beautiful meadow that includes the Slade Brook corridor. We're talking about this area in here. in 2014. Absolutely spectacular place. I was out on it yesterday with the landowner. Just a beautiful spot. Here's Corb in the center. And you can see it includes some tributaries of Slade Brook, a number of different wetlands, and it's really also a beautiful historical agricultural landscape. Back to Moose Mountain, and this time it's the Mill Pond Forest and the Huggins Trail access. In 2015, the Conservancy was given the gift of a conservation easement on 18 acres on Moose Mountain, including the headwaters of Mink Brook, Mill Pond, and the public trailhead. The owners were very concerned that after they no longer owned the land, the public might lose access to the whole network of trails on that part of the mountain, and they wanted to make sure that the public would always be welcome. So we're talking about Moose Mountain Lodge Road, which you see here in black, and the northern half of Mill Pond. The trailhead I just spoke of is right here. And here's Mink Brook coming down the mountainside. And these two little things that look like houses are symbols that indicate historic late 18th century grist and sawmill sites. Those are specifically protected in our easement. But you can see all the trails that you can get to by parking right here. You can walk up the tower right of way, and you can get back up to the South Peak in that direction too. It's a great spot. On the lower right-hand side is one of the remains of one of the abutments of that 18th century dam mill site. So the Shumways on the left and the Huggins family on the right protected this land with us, and we're very grateful that they did. Elisha Huggins in the red jacket did such work to keep some of the upper pastures on the land behind him open, which is partly owned by the Town of Hanover, the Dana Forest and Pasture Natural Area. Elisha kept that open with a hand scythe for many, many years. Now down to the rural part of Etna here, and this is the Hudson Farm. What an incredible spot. This was owned by Dartmouth College, and they were very, very generous in waiting until a conservation project could be put together to purchase that land and protect it. In 2017, we assisted the town and the Trust for Public Land in adding 175 acres here to the Appalachian Trail corridor in Etna. And the land that we're talking about is really this over here, this tier 2 and tier 3 habitat. Incredible cultural landscape, stone walls everywhere, abandoned sheep pasture. It's a fascinating spot. And it was a really special day when we finally got to celebrate it. That's Julia Griffin in the center and JT Horn of the Trust for Public Land on the right. And you see some federal dignitaries in here as well, because the National Park Service ended up purchasing the land. And it is managed now by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. We had no role in that in terms of conservation, other than to help with the fundraising, help with the communications, help get people excited about this project. And I think it was effective. All right, back to Moose Mountain and the Shumway Forest. And in 2017, we acquired a conservation easement on 313 acres here with the Shumway family. We had gone back to them to say, well, thank you so much for your easement on the Mill Pond Forest. What are your plans for your 313 acres up there? And they had just come off a proposal to build a radio tower up there, a communications tower that they really weren't very excited about having. And once that was off the table, then they said, you know, we'd really love to conserve this. Trails all over the place, including the Appalachian Trail. And the property is outlined here on the right-hand side in red. Looks a little bit like a gerrymandered election district. But you can imagine that this at one time was all part of one farm. Now, down here, this is privately owned land. Here's the Shumway Forest here. Dartmouth has this big piece here. The federal government has this piece that used to belong to the Mascoma Beagle Club, of all things. And so we went to work to try to protect this and all of the trails on it. And here you see a projection of that land draped over this Google Earth image of Moose Mountain. So you can see how important it also is to the visual and scenic aspect of Moose Mountain. Fabulous wetlands up there, and we were able to have the help of the Aquatic Resources Mitigation Fund from the state of New Hampshire to protect the land, because the Shumways wanted to make a bargain sale, very generously wanted to make a bargain sale of the easement. And so this helped protect these valuable wetlands as well. The little white jobs floating around in the center of the screen, this is not dirt on your screen at all. This is the inflorescence of bog cotton, which is a wonderful wetland plant. Good wildlife habitat, of course. Sundews, wildflowers, and bottle gentian. On the left are Kay and Peter Shumway, who at the time lived at Moose Mountain Lodge. And here they are just after they signed the conservation easement. I want to draw your attention to the image on the wall behind them. That is a spectacular image taken by Jim Block, who has lent it to us for display in our office. It shows Mink Brook as it comes off the mountainside in the Mink Brook Forest through the remains of that late 18th century gristmill. Peter sadly passed away about 9 months after this took place, very unexpectedly. But he said to his wife in the last week or so of his life, he said, you know, I am very proud of having done that. He said, I think it's one of the best things I ever did in my life, which still gives me chills. And again, very high quality wildlife habitat. We had a wonderful celebration up on Moose Mountain with the entire Moose Mountain Lodge extended family in the July of that year, and it was a great time. So back on the northern slope of Moose Mountain, and this is the Britton Forest, another glacial erratic. I'm still collecting them. This in 2018 was the gift of 79 acres adjacent to not only the Appalachian Trail corridor, but also right next to our Niles forest, so that we could really begin to assemble those pieces of unprotected land. So that's the area in here. And this parcel to the north is the Plummer Tract, which is owned by the town of Hanover with a 199-year lease on it, I think it is. But that's not going anywhere. So we have now this piece of the town, our Britton Forest here, the Niles Forest here, and all of the federal land with the AT corridor, all in one big forested block. This is Doug Britton as he's conveying the conservation easement with our former president, Christine McDevitt. And this is a fascinating property. It, of course, had a history as sheep pasture, stone walls everywhere. And also, I have to tell you, is the most intensely used bear habitat I have ever been in, including the Mink Brook Nature Preserve, where Mink the bear made such a reputation for herself. There were times when we were up there where you had to watch where you stepped. And I will just leave that there. Great bear sign of other types there. And here you see now on Moose Mountain, here's our Niles forest here. And this is pretty much where the Britton Forest is located. Takes a lot of work to understand our lands, and we do put a lot of effort into it, measuring a big maple on the Britton Forest there. Here's our program coordinator, Courtney Dragiff, checking a game camera on the Britton Forest, and keeping track of the birds, the wildlife, the flora, and the geology of it. Which brings us to the Mink Brook Community Forest. Boy, what a happy thing to be able to talk about. our organization had actually been working on this for over a generation. In 1998, when we were still an all-volunteer group, two of our board members approached the owners and said, we'd like to talk with you about the idea of conservation of this beautiful meadow and the hillside that you have nearby. That conversation didn't really go anywhere, but if you wait long enough and you're determined enough, things can happen, as we found out. If you look on the left here, you see, again, we're talking about the south parcel here with Mink Brook going through it, and the north parcel here, very high quality habitat. The town really pursued this in such a dedicated fashion, and the Trust for Public Land was right behind them to protect 250 acres here. And we helped by doing the cheerleading. And this is now a reality as of the end of February of this year. It's been a very long haul, but very, very exciting. You can see the north parcel here, Greensboro Road going here. This is Barrow Farms. Here's the south parcel. The blue blobs are wetlands. The Hudson Farm we talked about earlier, the Appalachian Trail corridor here, our own Greensboro Ridge natural area here. So you really get the idea that we're putting together the puzzle pieces to try to protect this habitat so that an animal here can get safely down here and go along the Mink Brook corridor to the Connecticut River. I took this picture of a moose on the upper left, maybe had to be 10 years ago now. I wondered why the DPW truck was pulled over by the side of the road, and I saw what they were looking at, and it's not a very good picture, but I treasure it. On the lower left, turkeys in the field. On the right-hand side is a beautiful winter picture of Mink Brook there, taken by Dr. Rick Vanderpoel, who is the ecologist hired by the town and Trust for Public Land to assess the habitat quality of the area. So these pictures are taken on the south side parcel. And then here's a glimpse of the very different landscape of the north side. There is stuff like this on the far side of the south parcel too, as well, I should say. But some wonderful ledges, a stream that is very important in the health of Mink Brook and keeping that area from flooding. And then, of course, there's that wonderful 1840s Greek Revival farmhouse that is there. This was carved out from the Conservation Project, and a new family has moved in who are appreciative of its wonderful historic qualities. So let's compare what 1970 was like when the first Earth Day happened, and as the first Clean Water Act was passed and the Clean Air Act came in. This is the extent of conservation land in our town. Pine Park since 1900, and then the Tanzi area in 1967, Balch Hill and that little bit of it in 1970. Compare that to just last year, before the Mink Brook Community Forest came in, right in this area. And now we can say that there is a substantial amount of conservation land, permanently conserved land in town. We're also showing on this map other pieces that are not permanently protected, but the town has an interest in them. And there's hope that they will have conservation management around them as well, including our major public water supply in the center here that you see. So approximately 22.8% of the town is permanently protected, either by the Hanover Conservancy, largely the federal government, or other entities as well. Upper Valley Land Trust has some parcels on the east side of town, and over, let's see, Oswell Farm in here, and then Huntington Hill as well. So about that green necklace that was such a concern in 1961, look how that has grown here. It really is something. It really is something. And there's no looking back. I think the moral of this story is that if you're somebody sitting in town meeting and you see something that needs to be done, step up to help your community. And then find some good partners, because it's really all about teamwork, and especially it's all about the future. So I want to thank you for exploring with us, and hope that perhaps this fall you might be able to join us for a 60th anniversary celebration on the summit of Balch Hill, where a lot of it happened. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, and hopefully you can all pop in with comments or questions, or somebody can set me straight on something. I'd love to hear from all of you. Anybody who wants to speak, I'll check the chat and see if there are any questions there. I don't see any yet. But if anybody would like to speak, please unmute yourself or wave your hand and let us know what's on your mind. We have a number of former board members here too. Yeah.
Adair, the Fullington Fields and Wilson's Landing, was that affected by the rowing thing that there was so much controversy about there?
No, because that easement was already in place. And
so they didn't encroach on it?
No. And the new owners of the rowing club will need to abide by the same conservation management restrictions that Dartmouth did when they owned the land. So that's the beautiful thing about a permanent conservation easement, is that it will always be managed the way that those who envisioned the conservation wanted it to go.
Wonderful.
Anybody else?
Yes. Thank you very much for the program, Adair. There's a lot we've been seeing a whole lot of bike activity during the pandemic, and as recently as yesterday was discussing with people about bikes in the arboretum that the Dartmouth is planning at where the golf course used to be in part of it. And I'm interested in how you're dealing with that in terms of bike use in park areas. It's a challenge because people like to do it. I'm mostly a hiker, but I do listen to the friends who like to bike. Fortunately, there are some good options around, which is something that we can refer them to. But are you anticipating any bike use in any of your territory? Well, the water company land it has some bike development in it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. Hi, Sarah. It is something that has been talked about regularly, and it partly depends on history. It depends on who the donors were, but it depends on soils as well. In places where there's really highly erodible soil, you kind of want to be not as encouraging about bike use as in other places where, for instance, on the Trescott lands, you've got all those historic roads. There have been roads there since the 1700s, and why not have a great place to enjoy bicycles there? Many people look at the Mink Brook Nature Preserve in particular and say, well, why can't we have a biker commuter like path through there so that we can get from 120 or from Sachem or whatever to downtown? And in that particular case, it was a condition of the gift from Dartmouth College, and another major gift that went into protecting that land, that because the purpose was to honor the Abenaki and their feelings about the preciousness of that land, they did not want to see anything other than just people enjoying it on foot quietly. And so we cannot allow any bicycles on that property for that reason. And we have a lot of education regularly that we have to keep reminding people about that. But there's some places where it's certainly compatible. And why couldn't you have fun out there on a bike if the geology is right, the soils are right, you haven't got a wetland there, or you put a place for bikes to go. So I didn't give you a very straight answer there, Bill, but is that good enough?
It's an excellent answer. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? One of the things I did want to mention is that our view of conservation is that it should embrace the historic cultural landscapes of our town. And so we are looking closely at places where things will intersect, like there are, wonderful vegetation or good hydrology that is important to protect, but also a landscape that speaks about what Hanover was in the 1700s, in the 1800s, and hope to be able to protect those things as well. These are priorities that are maybe not necessarily priorities of other organizations, but we feel strongly about it. So we have a few things on the drawing board. We hope we'll be able to share them with you sometime soon. And I have to say, you can't have conservation land without volunteers. And we have some incredible volunteers, some of whom are on this call today, who we couldn't do what we do without the volunteers.
Adair,
Yes, Cindy.
I mainly want to thank you. This was a very detailed, brilliant explanation of what's been done to protect lands, valuable lands in Hanover. And this will be put on our website, the hanoverhistory.org, so that people can study it. I think some of us would like to go over it and really absorb more of what you presented. And then some of us would like to actually take hikes in the areas that you presented too, obviously. And then I also want to mention that Here in Hanover, the magazine, I believe, has been in contact with you, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they have been taking our programs from the Hanover Historical Society and then taking pieces and putting them in articles. And our last presentation was on Grace Hill's story.
Yes.
And Jean Hennessy's story.
Yes.
And those stories will be brought into Here in Hanover too. So it's exciting for us. I know it's sort of a coffee table magazine, but it's very, very nice. Those of you who like to read, this is another way you can experience these programs. But this was just wonderful, Adair. You worked very hard on this. You have wonderful humor.
Oh, thank you. My children don't think so.
Terrific maps, and your dog is cute.
Oh, thank you. Well, actually, I should have said, when that picture was taken of the dog in the Mink Brook Community Forest, that picture was taken when we thought that we were just about to be able to get the landowners to cooperate on selling the land. That dog has been dead for 2.5 years.
Oh, sorry.
I now have a new one. Yeah. And who's,
I thought you did. Okay.
Yeah,
You have a new
yeah,
one.
that's it. So they keep coming and going. You did mention one other thing about going out and hiking. And I do want to tell you that one of my favorite things that I do is our Hanover Hikes of the Month. And because not everybody can come out with us on when we set a time for a naturalist-led free outdoor trip, we like to put things up on our website that people can download themselves with excruciatingly detailed directions, so that you're not going to get lost. You know how long it's going to take you. You know where you're going, and you know what you're going to see. And because I'm an historian as well as an amateur historian, as well as a biologist, I can't help but throw historic pictures in them and comments about the history of a particular piece of property. So I hope that they're as useful from that point of view as they are from here's this wildflower, here's that tree kind of stuff.
Wonderful. I think that's a big help, so people can go to your website. And also, I think you do a mailing sometimes with a list of hikes. And some of us, after this pandemic lifts more, would probably like to go in small groups. And I believe you used to do that, correct? You used to have small group walks.
Yes. We've before the pandemic, we had over 1,000 people out with us every year. Since the pandemic, we've been doing them. We skipped the spring program last year, but then we started back up in the fall with registration only, masks, and limited it to the town's limit of 10 people. So we're going to continue that through the spring, and then we're going to see what happens in the fall. Dudley, you had a question?
That's an amazing history of conservation in this town. Thank you very much for doing
Thank
that.
you. And it is only a small part of it. You know, the town has done wonderful, wonderful work on their own.
That's
And
fascinating. But let me ask you, what do you see in the future? I mean, it just seems like there is still so much land left to be conserved. Are you optimistic, or how do you view the next, say, 10 years?
oh, I think we have a moment right now, and I'm so glad you raised that, Dudley. We really need to accelerate conservation fast now for a couple of reasons. We have climate change coming down on our heads, and we need to protect that land, protect that habitat, keep the headwater streams acting as sponges to keep the flood down. We are experiencing incredible real estate market pressures from, there's a new term in our business, climigration. It's climate migrants. And there are people fleeing to the Upper Valley from California, trying to get away from the wildfires, from the coast, trying to get away from flooding. It is putting a lot of pressure on our market, and the prices are going up, and there are really valuable lands left to be protected that we really can't do without. But there's a real spirit for doing this here, and I cannot tell you how lucky I feel to be able to work in a community where people understand the value of conservation, and they appreciate it, and they get out on the trails during a pandemic and find the same kind of health and peace and relaxation that I do.
Thanks.
Off my soapbox, sorry. Anybody else whose picture maybe I'm not seeing? Hugh, yeah. Unmute yourself, Hugh. There we
There
go.
we go. That
Yeah.
helps.
Uh-huh.
Famous pandemic word, unmute yourself.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dare, for such an informative and comprehensive presentation. It was just really great. You know, you mentioned the Jim and Evalyn Hornig natural area on the river, and you mentioned the Huntington Hill Preserve on the top of Goodfellow or Huntington Hill and leading up to the edge of Moose Mountain. And just wanted to let folks know that there's a corridor of land through there, some preserved, much of it is. The Goodfellow farm that belonged to Sam Doyle and now the Lebrano family, Jim Kennedy's land, the nut property that was on Dogford Road, and another plot of land that is owned by Mary Hitchcock Hospital. And combine that with the Jim and Evalyn Hornig, that there's a green belt that goes literally from the river to the ridge of Moose Mountain. And there's a trail network all through there. And if people are looking for trails to go on, there's a whole series of trail network. Over the last 20 years, we've built 3 hiking bridges in that area across Slade Brook that have opened it up for folks to hike. And the Conservancy, the town Conservation Commission have all been involved in keeping those trails up and in constructing the hiking bridges, and just want folks out there that are looking for a great place to hike, that the opportunity is there.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to remind people that the Mink Community Forest is, the trails are going to be built. Hugh is a member of the Conservation Commission, which has been working so hard to create a very well thought out management plan with the help of Forester Jeff Smith of Butternut Forestry, Dr. Rick Vanderpool, and the Northern Forest Center, which consulted on it. And I mean, it was really a privilege for the Hanover Conservancy to sort of be on the edges of that project and help and see it go forward. But that's something we all have to look forward to, is maybe a celebration there this summer. We're hoping this summer or this fall, and then trails through the meadow and up on the side of the hill. And And we also should be grateful that we have such a great Trails Committee. Hugh chairs that as part of the Conservation Commission, and it's what helps all of us enjoy these lands I talked about tonight, but also other conservation lands that the town owns. Okay. Anybody else? It's been squawk because I can't see everybody on my screen at one time, but if not, have a lovely evening. And the weather's coming. It's coming. It's coming. And the trails will be, we can walk on them soon. So it's been great to be with you all tonight. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank
You,
you.
Adair.